Hello and good evening all. First, a bit of an explanation on what exactly this video is. Originally, I intended to approach the modern GT class overviews in largely the same way that I approached those for the LMDH and Le Mans hypercars. That is to say, by making the first video about one of the vehicles within the class, a combined 5-minute guide and class overview. However, the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Numbering the GT classes, and indeed modern GT racing on the whole, is largely an exercise in relativity. And relativity, of course, makes us all think of Dr. Einstein, and that, of course, leads us naturally to the bomb. So that is what we're going to talk about on this Wednesdayest of Fridays, Grand Tours as explained through nuclear war, specifically the DEFCON system, which I think and hope you'll find is an oddly helpful metaphor. For those unfamiliar with specific aspects of American defense policy and terminology, the Defense Readiness Condition, or DEFCON, DEF being defense and con being condition, they skip readiness to make it more pronounceable, I suppose, is a means of measuring the alertness state of the United States Armed Forces in 5 levels, with DEFCON 5 being the lowest peacetime state of readiness, and DEFCON 1 signifying that, well, let's just say we won't be worrying much about sports car racing anymore. Anyway, let's get started with DEFCON GT. That blissful state of peace that we haven't really enjoyed geopolitically since the mid-90s. Of course, there's no actual GT5 class, at least currently, but in the interests of our metaphor, we're going to use road cars as our base state. This is also our most diverse class, partly because it's kind of a non-class, because it encompasses literally anything you can get off the showroom floor or Facebook Marketplace, for better or for worse. While it is possible to turn a road car into a racer in the same way that the smallest of crises can be turned into a major conflict without an impact on the DEFCON system, peacetime interests us not. Let's get some planes in the air, cars on the track, and klaxons going. Okay, first step up. GT4 is the entry level into Grand Tourer racing. DEFCON 4 is termed double take, and to look at a GT4 race car, one might have to do a double take to realize that these vehicles aren't road legal. GT4 is the most accessible tier of GT racing, using machinery that is heavily production-based and modified only slightly for their on-track duties relative to the other higher performance machinery. GT4 is also the most recently developed class, created slightly after GT3 in the mid-2000s by SRO Motorsports to provide a relatively inexpensive alternative for, and gateway into, GT3 racing. This accessibility has proved the class's greatest strength with manufacturers, teams, and spectators. More than 40 vehicles have been homologated to date across the entire spectrum of the automotive world, from giants such as Mercedes, General Motors, and Porsche, all the way down to boutique manufacturers and revived marks like Ginetta, Dunkervoort, and hey, Chevron's back! Racing takes place on both sides of the Atlantic, in Asia and in Australia, with the biggest headline events the GT4 European Series, the 24-Hour Series, and IMSA's Michelin Pilot Challenge, which does admittedly run as a multi-class race with TCR, or touring cars. Through a balanced performance system, cars are kept competitive despite their sometimes hugely different origins, with average power in the 350 to 500 horsepower range, car weight about 1,300 kilograms, and top speeds generally around 160 miles an hour, which, gotta balance this, 1,300 cags is going to be 2,800 pounds or thereabouts, and 160 miles an hour is about 260 kph. Obviously, the top speeds depend largely on vehicle aero and track length. GT4 championships also act as a feeder series for the most talented or best connected to work their way up into the more powerful machinery running in the headliner race series and championships like the World Endurance Championship. While we don't have recorded lap records for GT4s on Circuit de la Sarthe, we do have them for 2 of the other tracks that we will be using as benchmarks for relative performance, those being Sebring International Raceway, because I'm biased, and Spa-Francorchamps. The best lap for a GT4 car at Sebring comes from Robbie Foley during the 2023 Alan J 120 round of the Michelin Pilot Challenge as a 2 minutes 10.378 behind the wheel of the gawping BMW M4 GT4 for Turner Motorsports. While the Spa record stands as a 2:28.679 from Ulysse de Pau in a Ginetta G56 set during an FFSA event this year, 2024. Fairly meaningless numbers at the moment, but they will be useful metrics to compare against as we talk about the other GT classes shortly. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given my comment just a second ago, the BMW M4 is by far my least favorite amongst the GT4s because it's hideous. And the Mercedes AMG GT is my favorite because it's A, lovely looking, B, makes an excellent noise, so too do most of the cars, and C, is very similar in side profile to the Porsche 928, which, although having one in my driveway does make me a bit biased, is a spectacular car with a remarkably prescient set of design features when examined in hindsight. Anyway, on to GT3. Defense Condition 3 is a state of heightened readiness, with the Air Force on 15-minute alert, turbines spooling, and weapons hot and armed. Or something like that. I have no functional understanding of how wars are fought. I'm a consultant for attorneys. But, codenamed Roundhouse, the GT3s certainly have rounded out the house, or the paddock, in an enormous number of race series the world over. GT3s, unlike GT4s, are our first full-fat, purebred track weapons and are the current international standard for GT motorsports, particularly now that we've lost GTE with the close of the 2023 WEC season. While GT4s are essentially production cars modified into race cars, GT3s are built as racers from the outset, merely bearing resemblances and similarities to the showroom models from which they are derived. These resemblances and similarities can be quite strong, but nevertheless they are built as race cars, not modified like GT4s are. GT3, like GT4, was conceived by SRO Motorsports slightly earlier in the mid-2000s as a means of providing a lower-cost alternative to the increasingly expensive GT1 and GT2 classes. Actually, I have to pause here. I made a mistake. GT4 did come after GT3. I had the two mixed up. GT1 and GT2 were starting to see manufacturer interest drop precipitously as a result of spiraling costs. Boom and bust cycles really are the consistent theme in racing, aren't they? The GT3 group is also our most diverse of the actual race cars, at least in terms of homologated models, at 58, although some of these have since lapsed from competition eligibility. I haven't been able to determine total production figures for all the homologated GT3s, because that would really be beyond the pale of this sort of short-ish video, but I do suspect it's greater than GT4, and know for a fact it's greater than GT2 or 1, so it may be our most populated class as well. Some of the manufacturer diversity comes from the original concept for the class, which allowed for the easy homologation of pre-existing one-make Cup models, such as vehicles for the Porsche Super Cup or Ferrari Challenge. Incidentally, Ferrari Challenge is an absolute rip to watch, largely because the amateur drivers are quite frequently just very well-heeled chaps having a midlife crisis without the first idea of how to drive a race car of the caliber that they've just purchased. Thus, we see very frequent talent shortfalls, which makes for very exciting viewing, if expensive cleanup. Nevertheless, the implementation of the balance of performance system from the class outset has allowed vehicles to be kept relatively competitive to each other, which has also encouraged new manufacturer involvement, like BOP or not. While precise specifications thus vary by vehicle and the set BOP, GT3s typically make between 500 and 600 horsepower these days, feature much more aggressive aero treatments than the GT4s, as we can see in this rear shot of a Mercedes AMG GT4 and GT3 right next to each other from last year's 12 Hours of Sebring. They weigh in at less than 1,300 kilos and are capable of about 180 miles an hour, so that's still in the neighborhood of 2,700 pounds or 2,800 pounds and about 300 kilometers an hour. More emphasis is placed on keeping power-to-weight ratio relatively equal than prescriptively setting absolute limits on vehicle specifications, although all GT3s are rear-wheel drive. Strike him waffly, Centurion. Although all GT3s are rear-wheel drive and powered solely by internal combustion engines. There's no hybrid gubbins here. Actually, I think they're all powered by gasoline engines. I don't think diesel is allowed. Like GT4s, they are equipped with a variety of driver aids, including traction control and anti-lock brakes, which help those moving up from slower classes cope with their new, more powerful machinery. Most GT3s were also developed in conjunction with racing or chassis partners, for instance, Ferrari's long-standing partnership with Kessel Racing, or General Motors' relationships with Pratt & Miller and Callaway cars, depending on which vehicle they're homologating. Today, you can find GT3s racing in the IMSA WeatherTech Sports Car Championship, the World Endurance Championship, a whole raft of national and international GT championships, and since 2021, in the DTM, which is the German Touring Car Masters, following dwindling manufacturer interest in manufacturing vehicles to the touring car specific rule set that had been in place in the DTM up to that point. Our lap records for the GT3s are as follows. We've got a 3 minutes 54.340 for Circuit de la Sarthe, set by Charles Wirtz, driving an Audi R8 Evo, obviously the LMS, not the LMP1, in 2021. No points of comparison for that one yet. At Sebring, we're just breaking the 2-minute mark with a 1:58.714 from the Aim Vasser-Sullivan Lexus, driven by Jack Hawksworth at qualifying for this year's 2024's 12 Hours of Sebring. Spa, on the other hand, well, we're still in the 2-minuters, with Raffaele Marcello leading the way with a 2:16.190 in an M4 GT3 set during this year's British GT round. What the British GT Championship is doing in Belgium is a bit harder to say, kind of like some of the place names in Florida. On the whole, this puts them about 10% faster than the GT4s, with obviously some variation depending on the nature of the circuit. I'm not sure I can actually pick a single favorite GT3. The AMG GT will always have my heart for the aforementioned reasons, but the SLS was homologated for GT3 as well. But so too has been the Lamborghini Gallardo, which remains one of the most compelling-looking designs of its era, and we also had the Aston Martin DBR S9 with a luscious V12 to provide its motive power. I also love the styling of the Astons from the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s, just another design that's going to be absolutely timeless, I think. There's also BMW's finest styling effort of the modern era, in my opinion, the Z4 GT3. Particularly in German racing white with BMW M accents, it's a particularly fine-looking vehicle. My antipathy for their more recent styling efforts remains, although the M4 GT3 is a bit better off than the GT4 by virtue of the more aggressive aero, minimizing the beaver dental work of the grille. And I'll give an honorable or dishonorable mention to Morgan's efforts in the field. As much as I love their cars in general, the Aero 8 and Aero Supersport GT3 were never going to win beauty contests, I'm afraid. The headlamps are just a bit wrong. Here's where things start to get serious. DEFCON GT2. With an exercise term code of fast pace and nuclear war looming, this too is appropriate. Following the demise of GT1's second iteration, which we'll get to in a moment, GT2 was the pinnacle of speed for racers that still at least look like their road-going brethren, although, as often as not, the road car seemed to take more from the race car than the other way around. GT2 was born in 1999 out of the old 90s GT3 rules, ironically enough, and went by several similar names, such as NGT, GTU, GTO, and just GT, while the GT1 class was also called GTS in its later guise, and Class E Speedemic Excellence, when the two ran contemporaneously. These names all came in the earlier years before the GT2 moniker was chosen in 2005. GT2 is also our first non-SRO developed class, with the regulations instead promulgated by the ACO, who stipulated, in delightful verbiage, that class entrance had to be based on cars, in quotes, with an aptitude for sport that could be used perfectly legally on the open road, end quotes, that were offered for sale to the general public. The affordability of the cars notwithstanding, probably the least expensive car upon which a GT2 was based was either a BMW M3 or the C5 Corvette. At least 100 of the road car had to be produced for homologation purposes. There was a reduced production threshold of 25 cars allowed for boutique manufacturers such as Panoz or Spyker, with the same base power plant as the race car. A more prescriptive set of rules than we saw in GT3 and GT4 also meant that exceptions frequently had to be made to maintain manufacturer interest, although our old friend the BOP ferry was still around to make sure things were kept generally competitive in the long run. These rules were a minimum weight, all up, so inclusive of fluids and fuels and so on, of 1,245 kilos or 2,745 pounds, maximum dimensions of 4.8 meters by 2.05 meters, exclusive of mirrors. Naturally aspirated engines were capped at 5.5 liters, while those with turbo or supercharging maxed out at 4 liters. There were exceptions to this, we'll get to in a moment. Fuel allowance was 90 liters or 24 gallons, although this, along with weight, were two of the aspects that could change with the balance of performance system. There was a nominal luggage space requirement of 0.15 cubic meters, which, if I've done the conversion right, would be about a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 15 centimeter cube, which is not even big enough to fit a helmet, and thus isn't exactly a yawning cavern of space in which to put luggage for weeks on end of driving along the Riviera or bushwhacking through the Okavango. Four-wheel drive was not allowed, but engine-based traction control was permitted, and gearboxes were limited to 6 speeds forward plus reverse. Exotic materials that had been in increasing use in GT1 were disallowed, such as carbon composites, titanium, or magnesium. Le Mans-specific bodywork was permitted, but other modifications were only permitted on a biannual basis unless special dispensation was given by the ACO. Additionally, newly homologated cars were allowed to make modifications after their first year of competition. There were some notable exceptions to the above rules, most notably the BMW Z4 GT2, which ran an M3-derived V8 rather than the road car's 6-cylinder engine, and the Dodge Viper, which was allowed to run the road car's whopping great 8-liter V10, tuned down to a red line of just 4,700 RPM to keep power outputs stable. Speaking of power, throughout the 24-year history of GT2, horsepower stayed pretty consistently in the 440 to 500 horsepower range, not entirely dissimilar to, and in some cases less than, GT3, with the primary differences between GT2 and GT3 being in the aero flexibility, the reduction of driver aids, and, depending on the race series, the availability of custom compound tires optimized and designed for each specific model. All of this added up to nevertheless facilitate substantially improved lap times over GT3. For our lap records, we have Alexander Sims's drive at the 2021 24 Hours of Le Mans to top the charts for the modern circuit, with a 3:47.501 in the Corvette C8R, 7 seconds faster than our GT3 record holder, and a similar 7-second gap on the 07 to 2017 iteration of the circuit, with Daniel Serra's 2017 lap record in an Aston GT2 Vantage ahead of Ben Barker, and a Porsche 911 991 GT3R. At Sebring, the gap narrows to about 4 seconds, with the Corvette C8R again our leader, this time with a 1:55.642 set by Antonio Garcia at the 21 12 Hours of Sebring. Spa, our gap narrows further to only 3 seconds, with Kevin Ast holding the lap record for GT2 with a 2:13.658 set also during the 21 season, during the WEC 6-hour race that year. A final note about the whole class naming thing. For the purposes of our metaphor, we've been calling the class GT2 because that equates to DEFCON 2. For 6 years, this was indeed the class name from 05 to 11, renamed from the disparate monikers of the earlier 2000s. In 2011, with GT1 extinct and dropped from the ACO classification, GT2 was rebadged as GTE, which is GT Endurance, while in IMSA it was rebadged as just GT, before eventually becoming GTLM, or GT Le Mans, to distinguish from GTD, which is GT David, or GT Daytona, which is the same as GT3, and now our only class of GTs in IMSA competition. GT2 as a class finally died out last year, 2023, with the close of the World Endurance Championship season and the WEC moving to a GT3 standard for 2024. If you're playing a drinking game where every time I say GT for this episode, please consider AA or something. However, GT2, GTE, GTLM are still eligible for historic events, and there are an increasing number of them in private hands and showing up at racetracks on both sides of the Atlantic. For instance, at Sebring Historics the past few years, we've had a C7R, a 911 RSR, and an M6 GTLM. I am still waiting on a Ford GT to show up, which is decidedly my favorite of the GT2s, and I don't really have an ugly duckling for this group, although I do think that the Panoz Abruzzi lets the side down relative to some of their other styling efforts. Of course, not actually fitting into the GT structure, so we'll consider it a dirty bomb relative to the rest of things. We've got the Freedom Machine from last year's Le Mans, the Garage 56 Camaro, which was faster than the GTEs, but not as fast as the LMP2s. So it's in the pursuit of really screwing with the metaphor and injecting some inappropriate irony. It's a terrorist nuclear weapon that doesn't work all that well. If this makes it into the edit, we'll know that I was really just plumbing the depths of absurdity. But I felt like I had to throw it in there because I have some pretty good pictures of the Garage 56 NASCAR and want to get some use out of them. Anyway, on to GT1. Okay, now it's time for everyone to get their titanium launch keys, break open the code word authorization packets, and duck in cover. DEFCON 1. And finally, we're at Cocked Pistol, DEFCON 1. The nukes are flying, or very soon about to, largely impacting the budgets of anyone who goes GT1 racing, and no holds are barred in pursuit of speed. Actually, we're going to be subdividing DEFCON GT1 into 3 categories, and this is going to be the longest section of the video, with the subdivisions based on the speed of the vehicles and the underlying complexity, because, like nuclear war, the definitions of GT1 get a bit messy through the years. We'll actually start at the end with the final GT1s, and we're going to be equating them to a tactical nuke. While these are brutally fast, big-budget racers, they are still road car-based in the same way that Davy Crockett and the W-54 Warhead that, while still nuclear weapons, and they would have reshaped the battlefield environment if they were ever deployed, were by no means capable of destruction on a truly enormous scale. The GT1s that raced in the 2000s were far more similar to the GT2s that came later, and were originally called GT2 until 1999 to distinguish them from the prototype GT1s that we'll discuss in a moment. So, yes, just to make sure we're keeping things straight, 2000's GT2 came from 90's GT3, 2000's GT1 came from 90's GT2, and essentially the 2000's LMP1/GTP class came from 90's GT1, while my sanity in mentally mapping all this out came from somewhere and has gone to nowhere because I should have done a flowchart. Anyway, our late GT1s ran far higher, although still regulated power outputs, custom chassis with styling heavily modified from the road cars upon which they were nominally based, and the most aggressive aero treatments we've seen yet. Horsepower figures were typically in the 600s, engine sizes were largely unrestricted, Dodge was running their 8-liter V10 without exemption, and the Corvette C5 and C6, as well as the Saleen S7, all ran 7-liter V8s. Pretty much everybody was running at or sub 1,200 kilogram weights without series-specific ballasts. Driver aids were disallowed pretty much universally. There was no traction control, no active suspension or active aero, nor ABS. They were kind enough to allow cockpit adjustable brake bias, fore-aft only, but there's an argument to be made that that crosses the line between driver aid, performance aid, and safety aid, so we'll give that one a pass. Even more so because there's no cockpit adjustable brake bias on modern road cars. Not that I'm aware of, anyway. GT1, like the classes that had come before, experienced diminishing manufacturer interest as the late 2000s economy soured, and the ACO dropped the class in 2011, leaving a legacy built on battles on both sides of the Atlantic between Pratt & Miller's Corvettes and ProDrive's Astons and Ferraris. We also had the Maserati MC12's success in the FIA GT Championship, following an unusually protracted homologation debate, and there was the Saleen S7R, which never amounted to much, but was quite handsome in its way. Next, we have the original GT1s from the early 90s, what I'll call our regular fission weapons, in that they're still, well, I can't say sensible and fitted for a specific purpose because it's nuclear warfare, but nor are they the insane terror weapons from whose use one cannot return. Born out of the failure of the World Sports Car Championship due to the Ecclestoning, see my Group C video for a quick explanation of that, the first GT1 through 4 rule sets were promulgated as a privateer series to stand alternate to Le Mans and the FIA, with GT1 proving the most immediately popular. A relatively loosely defined set of regulations allowed for some eye-raising entries under the original GT1 banner as factory teams came into the mix, such as the Dower 962C that won Le Mans in 1994, despite being an only loosely updated version of Porsche's inimitable 962 that had dominated the early Group C era. But we also got some of the great icons of GT1, cars that typified what GT1 was supposed to be, in vehicles like the Ferrari F40 LM, the Nissan Skyline GTR LM, the Jag XJ220, and the 1995 winner of Le Mans and my personal favorite of them all, the McLaren F1 GTR. 95 represented the last time a true GT car won Le Mans, and the F1 GTR was actually detuned to only 592 horsepower to comply with the regulations that year, losing some of the road car's top speed, but proving much quicker in the corners due to lower weight and some suitably aggressive aero. The rapidly growing popularity of the series, along with the rather fungible regulations, shall we say, mean that the F1's victory kicked off a rapidly escalating arms race to bring us to our final subvariant of GT1, the thermonuclear prototypes. In 1996, Porsche debuted this, the 911 GT1, which replaced the unsuccessful GT1-entered 993 GT2 Evo, and shared precisely 3 components with the 993 road car, that being the front and rear headlamps and the front subchassis. I suppose you could be counting that as 5 components if you number each headlamp assembly separately, but be that as it may. The rest of the car was pretty much another rehash of the 962C, because why mess with a good thing when you've got it? Essentially, the GT1 was therefore a full-on prototype, gussied up to look vaguely similar to a road car if you really squinted. Porsche did then go to design and build a road-legal production version of the GT1, the Strassen version, planned, but not built until 1997, so the rules lawyering was strong here. Usually it's just Ferrari that gets this kind of preferential treatment, but hey, Germany had just reunited less than a decade prior. Maybe that had something to do with it. It didn't. The announcement of the Porsche GT1 caused some substantial consternation among the current and considering entrants in GT1, as they felt the car wasn't in keeping with the spirit of the rule set. And to be fair, they had a point. Despite a strong performance by the car in its debut at Le Mans that year, the GT1s lost to Jost's Franken Porsche LMP, the WSC95, which used a Porsche engine on the old running gear of the Jag XJR14, and 1997 saw things really heat up when Mercedes made their return. Having continued their Group C Le Mans successes pre-Ecclestoning with a sufficiently dominant few years in the DTM that they raced themselves out of competition, Alpha and Opel, the two remaining competitors, threw in the towel in '96 and the championship folded, thus leaving the Mercedes racing boffins looking for another race series to utterly dominate. Their relatively recent experience with endurance racing led them back to our particular watering hole, and in a crash development program that reportedly only took 128 days, admittedly assisted by a McLaren F1 GTR purchased from Larbre Competition as a test mule and with chassis assistance from Lola, we got this car, the CLK GTR. Unlike the F1, however, the Mercedes team followed Porsche's example, and the new CLK used only the front and rear lighting assemblies, along with the front grille, from the newly released CLK class road car. Similar to Porsche, they then designed a road car to pay lip service to the regulations, with only one car finished to show at the Frankfurt Motor Show in '97, and the rest completed the next 2 years, even though it was superseded in the '98 season by the CLK LM. Points of argument in proof that the CLK GTR was indeed not a modified GT car and was instead a prototype. 1. Look at the damn thing. 2. It's built on a full carbon fiber monocoque with an aluminum honeycomb frame. Not really things you get in conventional road-going machinery, certainly not in the 90s. The 6-liter V12 is admittedly developed from the road-going V12 that Mercedes had available at the time, but it serves as a stressed member of the chassis, again, not something you get in regular road vehicles. I think one of the few cars of the era or ever to try this was the Ferrari F50, and that particular engineering decision was one of the reasons the F50 was so poorly reviewed compared to the F40 or Enzo, as the driving experience was described as, well, I'll let Clarkson explain.
But as it turned out, it didn't feel bolted in the back. It felt bolted to your back. As a result, the abiding memory for anyone who drove an F50 wasn't the ferocious acceleration or the 200-mile-an-hour top speed. It was the sense that you'd had a furiously spinning washing machine full of bricks hammering directly into your most sensitive pain receptors.
Despite the CLK GTR being the most expensive road car ever sold for almost 20 years after its introduction, the road car received criticism for poor drivability due to the racing-derived mechanicals, a teeny-tiny cockpit, even though the vehicle was nearly 2 meters wide, and perhaps less surprisingly, poor visibility. All things that one would admittedly expect to not have issues with in a Grand Tourer. Debuting in the '97 season, Mercedes took home the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships that year, despite some initial teething issues, eventually securing 6 wins and 6 second places across the 11 events. They were campaigning 3 cars. For '98, they pivoted to an improved design, the aforementioned CLK LM, which proved even more dominant, apart from a Porsche victory at Le Mans. And again, this indomitability proved their downfall, with everyone else pretty much giving up, and thus the iteration of the GT1 class folded in 1999 to give way to the Le Mans prototype regulations, with closed cockpit cars now called GTPs. These regulations would, of course, largely contest outright victory at Le Sarthe and around the world for the next 20 years or so. Speaking of the F50, Ferrari did also make a second attempt to get in on the GT1 action after customers had enjoyed racing success with privately modified versions of the F40. Developed in '95 and '96, the F50 GT was more in keeping with the spirit of the GT1 rules, as Ferrari had already put the F50 on sale and produced comparatively enormous amounts. It is worth mentioning that Ferrari nevertheless did get away with some rules chicanery related to the F50, getting the 333 SP prototype homologated in 1993 as running road-derived mechanicals, despite the power plant actually being a detuned F1 engine from 1990, and the F50 not shipping until '95. For more details, see the 333 SP video on the channel. Similar to the 333, in developing the F50 GT, Ferrari partnered with Dallara and Michelato to fundamentally redesign the car. This did actually cause the car to be quicker in testing than the 333, but this performance improvement was rendered irrelevant. Upon the reveal and acceptance of the Porsche GT1 in '96, Ferrari shuttered the expensive program in protest, repurposing their funds instead to focus on F1 again. For our last car spotlight in GT1, we'll talk about what I'd argue is Toyota's finest Le Mans entry to date, the GT1. That's one spelled out, O-N-E. After coming late to the Group C party, they did not do the same for GT1, with two relatively unsuccessful initial entries, a heavily modified Supra and an MR2 modified into unrecognizability, before finally pushing their thermonuclear button and entering a vehicle that had precisely no pretensions of being a road car. While technically including an enormously modified front chassis member to be compliant with the rules, they pretty much rules lawyered everything else well beyond any reasonable expectation. In furtherance of this direction, they left out any true luggage space, insisting that the fuel tank counted as luggage space as it was empty during scrutineering, and thus could technically fit a suitcase inside. Although doing so would of course make it impossible to go anywhere, unless they make Travel Pro-powered automobiles nowadays. Mercedes had actually also exploited this loophole by making the luggage cubby inaccessible beneath the rear bodywork, but really, claiming the fuel tank as luggage space is a touch too far, I'd say. Finally, Toyota disposed entirely with the idea of building road-going versions of the GT1, which did make the car only eligible for Le Mans, but as Porsche and Mercedes had gotten away with only building one or two cars to start, with the promise of building more, perhaps they were hoping for a rule change or exemption for the '98 season. Moreover, the single road-legal GT1 lacked any fundamental driver comforts or livability improvements that, again, at least Porsche and Mercedes paid lip service to with their Strassenversions. A second GT1 road car was built at some point, with both preserved by Toyota as display pieces. The GT1, along with the Porsche and Mercedes, was blisteringly fast, far quicker than the Le Mans prototypes that were nominally supposed to be topping the charts, but the only season of GT1 competition in which Toyota participated was 1998, and to call it a season is a bit much, again, as they were only eligible for Le Mans, and they lost one car to an accident that year, another to gearbox failure, with their third entry finishing 9th overall. Better results would come in 1999, but the car was by then classified as a GTP, and will thus be the subject for another video. I don't remember exactly where I read it, and it may be apocryphal, but I do recall someone writing that the GT1 produced so much downforce and had so much mechanical grip that it was one of only a couple cars capable of sufficient cornering speeds and accelerations sufficient to crack ribs. Definitely not something you could list as a road car selling point, so again, no road car pretensions whatsoever. There were, of course, other GT1s than those I've mentioned. Lotus made several attempts with the first-generation Elise. Lamborghini entered a modified version of the Diablo. Nissan, I mentioned, started with the Skyline GTR before getting into the prototype swing of things with their R390, itself another partial refresh of a Group C car. And Don Paynos did things a bit differently with the GTR1, which totally deserves its own video, and oh wait, there's already one also on the channel. To close out, some final lap records. The mid-2000s GT1s, or GTSs, as they were also called, were actually a bit slower than the GT2s or GTEs that replaced them on more grip-focused tracks. Tomasz Enge holds Sebring's lap record in a DBR9, about half a second slower than the Corvette C8R previously mentioned, at a 1:56.473 set during the 2006 Sebring 12 Hours. Our dear Czech driver holds the Le Mans lap record for the class as well, also driving a DBR9, set a year later in 2007 with a 3:48.969, about 3 seconds faster than the 2017 GTE record for that track layout, set by Daniel Serra in an Aston Vantage GT2, and reinforcing the importance of top speed to GTSs relative to the downforce focus of GT2s. At Spa, the GTS cars are a bit slower again, with Ollie Gavin's C6R lap from the 09 24 Hours of Spa coming in at a 2:15.423, about 2 seconds behind Kevin Est's 911 GTE. For the prototype GT1s, this is where the difference really starts to show and reinforce the far more prototype focus, especially in the later years. For reference, at Le Sarthe we are dealing with another circuit layout, so I'll be focusing more on lap times of that circuit layout rather than two more recent classes, as they're not entirely comparable. The Toyota GT1 holds the lap record as both a GT1 and a GTP at 3:41.809, in its GT1 guys, driven by Martin Brundle in the '98 Le Mans, and is a 3:35.032 as a GTP, set by, apologies in advance, Ukyo Katayama the subsequent year. Other points of comparison for that track layout stand with our GTS leader, Ron Fellows in a C5R at 358.862, and dear old Alan McNish, actually rather young at that point, in the excellent Audi R8 with a 337.359, both times from the 2000 race. The Sebring lap record stands, also on an older version of the track, with the Panos driven by David Brabham at a 157.453, but the sample size for GT1 prototype times is quite small for the track, so we'll take that one with a grain of salt. For Spa, we have to go back a couple of track iterations as well, with Bernd Schneider's 97 drive in the CLK GTR topping the charts for prototypes at a 2:12.058, just a hair faster than the best Group C result, and 4 seconds faster than the 1996 Thierry Boutsen lap in a 911 GT1. Interestingly, though, the fastest GTS lap is only 2 seconds slower than that, a 2:18.745 set by Andrea Picchini in a Ferrari 550 GTS at the 2002 24-hour race, which is quite a bit closer than we'd expect otherwise. It's always possible there were interceding circumstances. A 24-hour race does, of course, give you more temperature changes, and you may be able to get more power out of the 550's engine in the cool morning temperatures, but that's quite close. But there we have it. This was hopefully a relatively helpful explanation of the modern GT classes, with a little bit of help from our old friend, Nuclear War. That's definitely not a phrase I thought I'd be using when I started this channel. As always, let me know your thoughts, and for those of you who are US-based, if you've enjoyed any of the non-archival photos in this video, and would like a printed copy, and or to support the channel since we're opposed to monetization here, there's a link down below to the Buy Me a Coffee platform, and for a nominal donation, I'll be happy to print and mail to you the photo of your choice. Just put in the memo note thing on the donation the video and timestamp, and I'll reply back to you to confirm the exact photo and get your mailing address. A $5 donation will get you a standard 4x6 glossy print, a $10 donation will get you a single 5x7 or 3 4x6s, and $15 an 8x10 color glossy picture with no circles or arrows on the back, but I will write a short description of the car, time and date, and where I took the photo, as well as a note of thanks. If you'd like a larger size than that, or to confirm whether or not I have the publication rights to a specific picture, go ahead and comment on the video with the photo you're interested in, and we can figure something out. Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, our friends in foreign
always,
lands,
thank you for your time this
TBD,
evening,
or whenever,
I know
wherever
a good
you're
number of
watching,
viewers from the
and wish you all
EU,
good night and a good tomorrow.
costs
Are quite prohibitive. For this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube,
like, comment, subscribe.
go try a new recipe this weekend. In addition to making some freshly ground burgers for Independence Day next week, I'm going to be making this watermelon and shrimp salad? Side dish? Whatever it is, because watermelon are in season here in Florida, and I quite like shrimp. It's worth it to grill the shrimps rather than boil as called for in the recipe. It
just adds that touch of piquancy.
Anyway, that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.